One way I put it is, a lot of times in the 80s and 90s, churches thought, well, have to become more like the pop culture. So this is where a lot of Christian rock comes from. This is where, the drum sets in the back of the church service comes from, become more like the pop culture. I think that for the Catholic Church and other churches that have brought in more young people, it's the opposite. It's, more smells and bells. That is more traditional liturgy.
Hello. Welcome to Restoring America, a project of the Washington Examiner. As always, please make sure to subscribe on our YouTube channel and wherever else you may be watching. One of the things that we do here at Restoring America is that we look at the different cultural trends that are affecting America and how they can improve the nation or be destructive to it. And one of those things is the development of and nurturing of faith. I'm joined today by my colleague Tim Carney, and we're going to talk today about the Catholic Church. The Pope died this past week, which is a major event. It hasn't happened. A Pope dying in office hasn't happened in 20 years. But at the same time, what we're seeing in the United States is this massive resurgence of interest in the Catholic Church. A number of articles have been written across many different outlets: secular, conservative, liberal, Catholic, non-Catholic, exploring the idea of young people especially becoming Catholic. And I'm interested in your thoughts, especially given the news of this week.
Yep.
What is driving that and how Pope Francis fits into that?
Well, what's interesting is that what's bringing young people into the church is the exact opposite of what Catholic churches, mainline churches, evangelical churches thought they had to do 30 years ago to bring young people into the church. One way I put it is, a lot of times in the 80s and 90s, churches thought, well, have to become more like the pop culture. So this is where a lot of Christian rock comes from. This is where, the drum sets in the back of the church service comes from, become more like the pop culture. I think that for the Catholic Church and other churches that have brought in more young people, it's the opposite. It's, more smells and bells. That is more traditional liturgy. You see a lot of the young people are the ones more likely to wear these chapel veils, which is something that Catholics haven't worn for decades. But, it's a sign of modesty. It's more formal dress. It's kneeling at altar rails to receive communion. And so a lot of the move into the Catholic Church, this is an explanation of why it's happening, but sort of how it's happening is in more traditional forms of worship, including the traditional Latin Mass.
Yeah, well, I think both of us are pretty devout Catholics. I personally attend the Latin Mass, I think, more often than you do.
Yeah.
But and that's one thing that I've always been noticed is that the congregations at these more traditional parishes skew much younger. They have more children,
yes,
generally. And then when you go to the churches that are still kind of, espousing the spirits of the 1970s,
yep,
those tend to skew older.
Those are going to be the older ones,
and
yes.
There's more space in the pews.
Well, and then the priests, I remember I used to do the McLaughlin group. I remember telling Eleanor Clift, and she was shocked to learn this, and this was, 10 years ago, when I said, do you know that every priest who was born, who grew up under John Paul II or later is a lot more conservative than the priests who are your age? And she was sort of shocked about that. If you know a priest who is under the age, who was younger than I am, younger than 46, they're probably going to be sort of religiously more orthodox. And if they're politically more conservative rather than the sort of social justice type that the boomers might think of.
I think there's a quote from G.K. Chesterton, who's a very well-known Catholic author. You said that if you marry the spirit of the age, you become a widow in the next. And there's a kind of truth to that, especially with the way that religion is kind of approached reaching out to young people. It's like, so we reach out to young people in the 1960s and 70s. They're going to get older, and what's appealing to them is probably going to stay pretty constant. But what's appealing to other generations might not be the same.
Well, and so Francis comes from an earlier generation, and so he's thought of as a pastor. He was the first pastor pope of our lifetime, because you had Benedict, who was a bit of a philosopher. Then before that you had John Paul II, who was a theologian. And when Pope Francis came from the streets of Argentina, from sort of thinking about the poor and the inclusion of the poor, he didn't change, church teaching to make it more socialist or less pro-life or any of those things that the mainstream media thought that he was doing. But he did sort of change some of the emphasis. But then again, Benedict and John Paul II, they were not hardcore kind of traditionalists. And and Francis, of course, did in some ways go to battle with you can talk more about the Latin Mass stuff, but so in the question about the next pope will be sort of, for American Catholics, will the traditionalists sort of have a rival in the pope, or will they have a friend, or will they have somebody who's just sort of neutral?
Yeah, and I think especially in America, where the Latin Mass, the United States has been probably the country that has had the largest interest in Latin Mass, only followed by France somewhat closely, but in that sense, there's a very specific interest in who's going to be his successor, and will he kind of depart from what Pope Francis did in the United States, or when it comes to Latin Mass? Because as you pointed out, that there's been a lot of interest and an explosion in focus on that in the United States in many dioceses. I'm curious to think what you think about in terms of how Pope Francis will be seen by American Catholics by and large, and what was the defining legacy in America for him? He came here one time.
Yep.
In 2015, and which was a decade ago, but he was a media darling in a way
Yes.
that his predecessor was not. So.
Yes. It's hard to say, because it's hard to say whether this is a turn in the church or just sort of a 12-year period. It's really hard to judge these things. And again, for me, I have so many friends who, like you, are more Latin Mass types, and they see him as a guy who might have taken away the Mass that they were used to going to, but that's a small minority of Catholics. I know lots of conservative, faithful Catholics who, have been going every week, who they don't love the guitar Mass or anything like that, who they really appreciated something pastoral about Pope Francis. And I think in the long run, that sort of attitude, his mood, there's a line that a shepherd should smell like sheep. And that this was a guy who really got down there with people. I mean, John Paul II was a hero at ending the Cold War. But if you've read his stuff, which is great and brilliant, and my kids read it in Catholic schools, but it was really hard to read, right? It was not written.
It's pretty heady stuff.
It was not written for the average man. And Pope Benedict, he sort of lived in the church hierarchy for so long that he had this separation. Here you had this guy, Francis, who a couple decades before had been on the streets of Buenos Aires. And so I think that, if I had to guess 100 years from now how he's seen, he's going to be remembered as the pastor from the streets of Buenos Aires who became the Pope, who smelled like the sheep that he was shepherding.
Right, and there's famous pictures of Pope Francis before he became Pope, riding the bus, in Buenos Aires, and then even when he was Pope, even this past week, just a mere days before he died, he was, visiting a prison, during Holy Week, which has been kind of a thing that he's done every year of his papacy.
And dialing down some of the formality. Mm-hmm. And again, some people thought he dialed it down too. He was still super formal. I mean, he's the Pope, right? Yeah. But he dialed down some of the formality in that. Will that stick around? That would be an interesting question looking forward. Will the next Pope go back to some of the more formal attire, formal approach? But that was, again, part of his being sort of the man of the people.
And I was, for me, one of the most memorable moments, and I think J.D. Vance, the vice president, also has mentioned this as well, but the most memorable moment, I think, of his papacy, I think, was when he went out and blessed the empty St. Peter's Square during COVID. And even for me, who has struggled with some of the things that he did, that was, to me, such a very moving and powerful thing that he did, and I'm just
and I would hope that the next pope will also just think about the cultural poverty in places like Europe and the United States, because when people talk about the falling marriage rates, the falling birth rates in a place like the U.S., and you're looking at child tax credit or this policy or that, none of that is going to do even a tenth as much as a spiritual revival would be. If we got more people back in the pews, you would have less divorce, more marriage, more kids, less drug abuse, less violence. And so if the Catholic Church could somehow look and attend to that poverty, that would be huge.
What's going to be the thing that you remember the most about Pope Francis?
I think it would probably be when he made his visit over here, and that he, being in the American media, we look at things through that lens, and that he sort of shook up. That I took that opportunity to read what he wrote about the poor, for instance, and he wrote again and again about the inclusion of the poor. That is to say, we have a duty to make people who are poor less poor, but also to include them in our lives. So you can't just cut a check. You can't just throw a sandwich out the car window at the poor people. But when he talked about the poor, he talked about the inclusion of the poor. And then he wrote an encyclical, Fratelli Tutti, which was about how we really do need connection, and connection not just to all people in the world, but specifically to our physical neighbors. So those two things actually really shaped my thinking, and what I focused on in my journalism was human, real-life inclusion with the person who's physically proximate.
Tim, thank you so much for being here. As always, if you go to washingtonexaminer.com, we've got great commentary and other pieces for you to read, including on the Pope and the upcoming conclave. And be sure to subscribe. Thank you.